In the middle of the celebratory dinner, my daughter Jasmine raised her wine glass high above her head and shouted loud enough for everyone in the restaurant to hear, "Listen up, everyone! My mama is our personal ATM machine. Order whatever you want off the menu. Go crazy! It's all on her!" Laughter erupted throughout the bayou room, like a wave of mockery crashing over me. I sat frozen in my chair, my hands gripping the edge of the white linen tablecloth as I watched 35 relatives, people I'd helped financially over the years, people I'd fed and housed and supported through countless crises, begin pointing excitedly at the most expensive items on the elaborate menu. Maine lobsters flown in fresh that morning, imported French wines with price tags that made my stomach turn, desserts with names so fancy they couldn't even pronounce them properly, just pointing and laughing and ordering with abandon. The servers rushed from table to table in the private dining room, taking endless orders, their faces professionally neutral, but their eyes occasionally flickering to me with what looked like pity. I sat there, feeling my face burn with humiliation as my daughter celebrated my public degradation as if it were the most hilarious joke anyone had ever told. When the head waiter finally approached my table an hour later and presented the bill on a small silver platter with a practiced flourish, the number hit me like a physical blow to my chest. $19,500. The numbers swam before my eyes as I stared at the receipt, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. 35 pairs of eyes fixed on me from around the room, waiting expectantly, some people already starting to stand up and gather their things, ready to leave now that they'd gotten what they came for. I took a deep breath that felt like it might be my last, calmly picked up my purse from the chair beside me, and said with the most composed smile I could manage, "I need to use the restroom for just a moment. I'll be right back to take care of this." I stood up slowly, my legs trembling beneath my navy blue dress, the one I'd bought specifically for this occasion because I'd foolishly believed my daughter actually wanted to honor me. I walked through the tables with my back straight and my head held high, past all those relatives who'd taken so much from me over the years, and I slipped out through the main entrance of the bayou room into the warm New Orleans night. I didn't look back. I hailed a taxi that was dropping off customers at the restaurant next door, gave the driver my address in the Garden District, and disappeared into the heavy Louisiana darkness. What happened next in that restaurant, what chaos and horror unfolded when they realized I wasn't coming back, is something my family still recalls with a mixture of anger and shame more than 2 years later. My name is Susan Richardson. I am 62 years old, and for most of my adult life, I was an English literature professor at a public high school here in New Orleans, Louisiana, teaching teenagers about Toni Morrison and Maya Angelou and Langston Hughes, trying to show them that their stories and their voices mattered in American literature. I am not wealthy by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm certainly not poor either. I've been a widow for 7 years now. My husband Thomas died of a sudden massive heart attack one Sunday afternoon in July while he was watering the azaleas and camellias on our front porch, plants he'd tended lovingly for 15 years. He collapsed right there among the flowers he loved, and by the time the ambulance arrived, he was already gone. Everything changed after that loss, but not in the way anyone might expect. It changed because over time, slowly and insidiously, I became something I never intended to be, something I didn't even recognize until it was too late. I became the solution to every single problem my family had, the answer to every financial crisis, the safety net that never failed to catch them no matter how recklessly they jumped. Jasmine is my only daughter. She's 40 years old now. She studied graphic design at Tulane University on a partial scholarship that I supplemented with thousands of dollars from my teacher's salary and my savings. But she never truly committed to building a real career in her field. There was always an excuse ready, always a reason why success eluded her. The market was too competitive. Clients didn't want to pay fair rates. She needed better professional connections. She needed better equipment. She needed more time to build her portfolio. I, like what I thought was a good and supportive mother, always believed her excuses and tried to help. I paid for her entire 4 years of college education, every tuition payment, every textbook, every art supply, every late-night pizza when she was studying. I bought her first professional computer, a top-of-the-line Apple that cost me 3 months of my salary. I financed 2 failed business attempts that collapsed before the 3rd month, each time with Jasmine promising this was finally going to be the one that succeeded, the one that made all my investment worthwhile. When she married Curtis Williams 7 years ago, right after Thomas died, Curtis seemed like a nice enough guy on the surface. Polite, well-spoken, always knew the right thing to say to me. But he had no real ambition, no drive, no fire to build anything substantial with his life. He drifted from job to job, always with grand explanations about why each position wasn't the right fit, why he deserved better, why he was holding out for the perfect opportunity. I paid half of their wedding costs, a beautiful ceremony at a historic church in the French Quarter, followed by a reception at a restaurant on Magazine Street. $12,000 of my retirement savings gone in one day. When they had trouble making rent on their apartment in Mid-City after Curtis lost yet another job, I helped them for 6 months straight, writing checks every month while they got back on their feet, which somehow never quite happened. And so it went. Again and again, crisis after crisis, need after need, because that's what mothers do, right? They sacrifice everything. They give without limits. They are the invisible support system that never fails, never complains, never expects anything in return. But the truth is, I did expect something in return. Not money, not expensive gifts or grand gestures, just a little basic respect. A phone call once in a while that wasn't immediately followed by a request for money. A visit that didn't end with Jasmine subtly checking my wallet to see how much cash I was carrying, or asking if I could loan her a few $100s until her next freelance check came in. I wanted Jasmine to see me as her mother, as a human being with feelings and needs and limits, not as her personal bank account with a password she'd figured out long ago. But over the years, slowly and painfully, I learned that to Jasmine, I was exactly that. An ATM with easily ignored feelings, a resource to be exploited until there was nothing left. It wasn't just Jasmine who treated me this way. My younger sister Aisha Wells, who lived in a beautiful home in Metairie that was twice the size of mine, also had a habit of calling me just before the end of each month, always with the same sweet, false tone in her voice that made my stomach clench with dread. "Susan, darling sister, could you lend me just a little something to help me through? You know how things are with the economy and all." Aisha lived in that big house, drove a brand new Lexus that she traded in every 2 years, dined out at expensive restaurants in the warehouse district every weekend, and took beach vacations to Destin and Gulf Shores twice a year. But according to her carefully constructed narrative, I was somehow the one with money to spare because I lived modestly and saved carefully. The loans never came back. Not a single one. Not a penny. After a while, I stopped calling them loans and accepted them for what they truly were, forced gifts extracted through family obligation and guilt. Then there was Roel, my cousin on my mother's side. Every time we met at a family gathering, whether it was someone's birthday party or a holiday dinner or a funeral, she'd find a subtle way to sidle up next to me and whisper some urgent financial need in my ear while everyone else was distracted. Her son Malik needed money for college application fees. She had an unexpected medical bill from an emergency room visit. Her washing machine had broken down, and she needed a new one immediately. Her car needed repairs. Her roof was leaking. It was always something new, always presented as a temporary emergency, always with the unspoken understanding that family helps family without question or expectation of repayment. And I, like a fool, always ended up opening my purse right there, pulling out whatever bills I had or promising to write a check when I got home, while Roel hugged me tight and called me an angel sent from heaven and promised to pay me back soon. A promise we both knew was a comfortable lie. I remember one Christmas about 4 years ago when Jasmine hosted a holiday dinner at the house she and Curtis were renting in Gentilly, a place I was helping them afford through monthly contributions I pretended were gifts rather than the rent subsidies they actually were. I arrived with carefully wrapped gifts for everyone as I did every year, presents I'd spent weeks searching for and selecting with care and love. I had spent hours in shops around New Orleans, finding the perfect gift for each person. For Jasmine, a set of professional art supplies she'd mentioned wanting, expensive colored pencils and markers imported from Japan. For Curtis, a leather wallet I'd seen at a boutique on Royal Street that I thought matched his style. For their children, my grandchildren, educational toys and books I knew they would enjoy, and that might spark their curiosity about the world. When it was time to open presents after dinner, Jasmine unwrapped hers while talking to someone else, barely glancing at the art supplies before setting them aside. She looked at me for maybe 2 seconds and said in a flat, distracted voice, "Oh, thanks, Mama, although honestly, I would have preferred cash so I could buy exactly what I need for my business. You know how specific my requirements are." There was no hug, no kiss on the cheek, no genuine gratitude or appreciation. Just that single sentence that sliced through me like a cold blade, leaving a wound that bled internally where no one else could see it. That night, as I drove back through the dark streets to my house in the Garden District, past the beautiful old homes decorated with Christmas lights, I cried the entire way. Not because of the money I'd spent on gifts that weren't appreciated, though that stung. I cried because I finally understood with brutal clarity that to my daughter, to my family, I was not a person with feelings and needs and desires of my own. I was simply a source of resources, a means to an end, a problem solver who existed to make their lives easier without any consideration for my own well-being or happiness. Worst of all, I had allowed things to reach this point through my own actions. Year after year, sacrifice after sacrifice, enabling behavior after enabling behavior, I had built this monster with my own 2 hands, trained my family to see me as nothing more than a wallet with legs. But even that painful Christmas night, even that moment of devastating clarity, was not enough to make me change my behavior. Not yet. The patterns were too deeply ingrained, the guilt too powerful, the fear of being seen as selfish too overwhelming. I kept giving. I kept paying. I kept saying yes to every request. I kept being the silent, reliable family ATM, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, never charging interest, never expecting repayment, never demanding respect or appreciation in return for my endless generosity. I kept sacrificing my own retirement dreams, my own security, my own peace of mind, telling myself it was what good mothers and good sisters and good family members did, until that cursed Wednesday afternoon, when everything finally came to a head. The day Jasmine called with her invitation to dinner. The day she set the trap. The day she decided to publicly humiliate me in front of 35 family members at the most expensive restaurant in the French Quarter. The day I finally understood that enough was truly enough. That some lines cannot be uncrossed. That some humiliations cannot be forgiven or forgotten. The day everything exploded and I made the decision that would change my life and my family's lives forever. It all started with a phone call on a Wednesday afternoon in late September. I was sitting in my living room in my favorite armchair by the window, reading Beloved by Toni Morrison for probably the 20th time in my life, a book that always brought me comfort no matter how many times I returned to it. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the lace curtains, and I could hear the sounds of the neighborhood outside, children playing, someone mowing their lawn, the distant sound of jazz music drifting from somewhere down the street. The phone rang, and I saw Jasmine's name on the screen. I hesitated for a long moment before answering, my finger hovering over the button, because lately, over the past several years really, every single call from my daughter ended the same way, with a request for money dressed up in various creative disguises. But she was my daughter, the child I'd carried and birthed and raised, and mothers always answer no matter how many times they've been hurt. "Mama, I have wonderful news," Jasmine said in an unusually cheerful, almost giddy voice I hadn't heard from her in years. "I want to organize a special family dinner to thank you for everything you've done for us over all these years. You really deserve it, and I want everyone to be there to celebrate you." I was silent for several seconds, processing her words carefully, turning them over in my mind and examining them from every angle, like a puzzle I couldn't quite solve. Jasmine wanting to thank me? Jasmine organizing something that didn't involve asking me to pay for it or contribute financially? Something in my stomach twisted with instinctive suspicion born from years of disappointment, but I immediately felt guilty for doubting my own child, for not taking her words at face value. "A dinner?" I asked cautiously, trying to keep the skepticism out of my voice. "To celebrate me?" "Yes, Mama," Jasmine said, and I could hear the smile in her voice, genuine-sounding enthusiasm that made me want to believe her, despite all my experience telling me otherwise. "At the Bayou Room, you know, that beautiful place in the French Quarter that just opened last year. Everyone says it's incredible. I'll invite the whole family, all the people who love you and appreciate what you do for us. It'll be elegant and special. This Saturday at 7:30 the evening. Does that work for your schedule?" I accepted the invitation even though a persistent voice in the back of my mind whispered warnings I chose to ignore. Even though every instinct I'd developed over 62 years of life told me this wasn't a celebration, but rather a setup for something I couldn't quite see yet. Even though I knew better, I said yes because I desperately, pathetically wanted to believe that my daughter finally saw me, that she had matured, that she understood and appreciated even a fraction of what I had sacrificed for her throughout her entire life. I spent the days leading up to that Saturday dinner with a confusing mixture of hope and anxiety churning in my stomach. Part of me allowed myself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, Jasmine had grown up, had reflected on our relationship, had come to understand how one-sided it had been for so many years. Maybe she wanted to make amends. Maybe this dinner was the beginning of a new chapter in our relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than financial exploitation. I went shopping at a boutique on Magazine Street and bought a beautiful navy blue dress, something elegant but not too flashy, appropriate for a nice restaurant, but not trying too hard. I made an appointment at a salon and had my hair professionally styled for the first time in over a year. I even splurged on a pair of pearl earrings I'd seen in a jewelry store window months ago, but had never allowed myself to purchase because I was always saving money to help someone else with their latest crisis. For once, just this once, I wanted to feel special, wanted to feel worthy of celebration, wanted to believe that my family finally valued me as more than just a source of money. On Saturday evening, I arrived at the Bayou Room at exactly 7:25, 5 minutes early, as was my habit. It was one of those new restaurants that had opened in the French Quarter, specifically to cater to tourists and wealthy locals. The kind of place where everything from the lighting to the music to the way the servers moved was carefully calculated to create an atmosphere of refined Louisiana elegance. High ceilings with exposed brick walls painted white. Wrought iron chandeliers that looked antique but were probably reproductions. Tables covered in crisp white linen. Fresh flowers in crystal vases. Soft jazz playing in the background, something instrumental and soothing. I had never been to the Bayou Room before. Looking at the prices on the menu board near the entrance made my teacher's pension seem very small and inadequate. When I entered through the heavy wooden doors, a young hostess in a black dress greeted me with a professionally warm smile and asked if I was with the Richardson party. When I confirmed that I was, she guided me through the main dining room toward a private room in the back that Jasmine had reserved for the occasion. When those doors opened and I stepped inside, I froze completely, my feet refusing to move forward as my brain tried to process what I was seeing. There weren't 10 or 15 people as I'd vaguely imagined when Jasmine said family dinner. There were at least 35 people packed into that private dining room, filling every seat at the long tables that had been arranged in a U-shape. 35 relatives, some of whom I hadn't seen in years, some of whom I barely recognized, all of them turning to look at me as I stood in the doorway. Jasmine rushed over immediately, wearing a dress that I recognized had cost at least $400 based on the designer label I could see, and threw her arms around me in an embrace that felt performative rather than genuine. "Mama, you're here! Everyone, my mama is here! Let's get this celebration started!" The room erupted in applause and cheers that should have made me feel honored but instead made my stomach drop with a feeling I couldn't quite name yet, something between dread and foreboding. I was guided to a seat at the center of the U-shaped table arrangement, the place of honor, supposedly, positioned so that everyone in the room could see me clearly. Jasmine sat to my right, Curtis to my left, both of them smiling in ways that didn't quite reach their eyes. I recognized faces around the room. My sister Aisha sitting with her husband, both of them already studying the menu with intense interest. My cousin Roel with her son Malik, who was supposed to be in college now thanks to money I'd given them 2 years ago for tuition. Various nieces and nephews, some of their children, extended family members, I saw maybe once or twice a year at weddings or funerals. And all of them, every single one, had at some point over the years asked me for money, asked me for help, asked me to solve their problems with my checkbook while offering nothing in return but empty promises and shallow gratitude. The first 20 minutes passed in a blur of forced small talk and fake enthusiasm. People came up to my seat one by one to hug me and thank me for coming, their words polite but their eyes already darting to the elaborate menus that sat at each place setting. The menus were leather-bound and embossed with gold lettering, the kind of pretentious detail that signaled exactly how expensive this restaurant was. I picked up my own menu with trembling hands and felt my blood pressure spike as I scanned the prices. Appetizers starting at $28. Entrees ranging from $65 for a pasta dish to $145 for the premium seafood platter. Bottles of wine listed at prices that made my monthly mortgage payment look reasonable by comparison. This wasn't a family dinner. This was financial suicide. "Isn't this place amazing, Mama?" Jasmine said loudly, her voice carrying across the room with theatrical enthusiasm. "I knew you'd love it. You've always appreciated the finer things in life, and tonight we're going to celebrate you the way you deserve." Before I could respond, before I could ask the question that was burning in my mind about who was paying for all of this, the servers began taking drink orders. And that's when it happened. That's when the trap was sprung. Jasmine stood up from her seat, her wine glass already filled with expensive Chardonnay, and raised it high above her head with a flourish. The room fell silent, everyone turning to look at her with anticipation. "I want to make a toast," she announced, her voice projecting to every corner of the room, her smile wide and bright and completely devoid of genuine warmth. "To my amazing, generous, incredibly selfless mother, Susan Richardson." Everyone raised their glasses and murmured agreement, and I felt a brief moment of hope that maybe I'd been wrong, maybe this really was just a celebration. But then Jasmine continued, and that hope died instantly and completely. "My mama," she said, drawing out the words, "is our personal ATM machine. She never says no to family, she never runs out of money for us, and tonight is no exception. So everyone, order whatever you want off this menu. Get the lobster, get the most expensive wine, get multiple desserts, go absolutely crazy because my mama's got this, it's all on her." The room erupted. Not with shocked gasps or uncomfortable silence as one might expect from such a cruel statement. No, the room erupted with laughter and applause and cheers, as if Jasmine had just announced free money for everyone. I sat frozen in my chair, my face burning with humiliation so intense I thought I might actually be sick right there at the table. People started grabbing their menus with renewed enthusiasm, pointing at items, calling servers over, placing orders with abandon. "I'll have the butter-poached Maine lobster with the truffle risotto. Bring us 2 bottles of that Bordeaux from 2015. We'll start with the oysters Rockefeller and the jumbo lump crab cakes. Don't forget to save room for dessert. They have that chocolate soufflé that takes 30 minutes to prepare." The servers rushed around the room taking orders, their pens flying across notepads, their faces carefully neutral, but I could see the calculation happening behind their eyes as they tallied up what this dinner was going to cost. I tried to catch Jasmine's eye, tried to signal to her that this wasn't okay, that I hadn't agreed to this, that she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But she deliberately avoided looking directly at me, too busy laughing with Curtis and calling out her own elaborate order to a server. I sat there for the next 90 minutes in a state of numb shock as course after course arrived at the tables. Appetizers that cost more than my weekly grocery budget, entrees that could have paid my utility bills for a month. Wine flowing freely, bottle after bottle being opened and poured and consumed. And through it all, the laughter, the jokes at my expense, the casual way my family treated my humiliation as entertainment. Susan's finally getting that fancy dinner she always wanted, and she's paying for it herself. Someone shouted from across the room to more laughter. ATM Susan, can you loan me some cash for dessert? Another relative called out, finding their own cruel joke hilarious. I wanted to stand up and walk out right then. Every cell in my body screamed at me to leave, to refuse to participate in my own degradation. But I was paralyzed by a lifetime of conditioning to be polite, to avoid making scenes, to prioritize family harmony over my own dignity. So I sat there and endured it, my hands folded in my lap, my face carefully composed into a neutral mask that hid the devastation happening inside me. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 90 minutes, the servers began clearing the dessert plates. The meal was over, the damage was done, and now came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The head waiter, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s wearing a perfectly tailored suit, approached our table carrying a small silver platter. On it sat a leather folder containing the bill. He placed the leather folder in front of me with a practiced, almost apologetic gesture, as if he understood exactly what was happening and felt sorry for me, but was powerless to intervene. The room fell silent instantly, all conversation stopping, all eyes turning to watch me like spectators at a gladiator fight waiting to see blood spilled. I opened the folder with hands that had started trembling uncontrollably and looked at the number printed at the bottom of the itemized receipt. $19,523. The numbers seemed to pulse and grow larger as I stared at them, my brain struggling to process that amount, to comprehend what it meant. That was nearly 4 months of my pension. That was the money I'd been saving to finally fix my roof that had been leaking for 2 years. That was my emergency fund, my security blanket, my protection against disaster. And my daughter had just spent it on a single dinner to humiliate me in front of 35 people who all believed I deserved this treatment. I looked up from the bill and saw Jasmine watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not guilt, not remorse, something closer to challenge. As if she were daring me to refuse, to make a scene, to embarrass her in front of everyone by not paying. Curtis was watching too, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, clearly enjoying my discomfort. Around the room, family members were starting to gather their purses and jackets, preparing to leave now that they'd gotten what they came for, their free $600 meal courtesy of Susan the ATM. I took a deep breath that hurt my chest, feeling like I was drowning in that elegant private dining room with its white walls and soft lighting and jazz music still playing cheerfully in the background. I picked up my purse from the chair beside me, feeling the weight of it, the worn leather strap that I'd had for 10 years because I couldn't justify buying a new one when I was too busy helping everyone else. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking beneath me, but somehow holding, and I looked at my daughter for a long moment. She stared back at me with those eyes that I'd looked into when she was a newborn, when she took her first steps, when she graduated high school. Eyes that had once looked at me with love and trust, and now looked at me with nothing but entitled expectation. I need to use the restroom for just a moment, I said clearly, my voice surprisingly steady given that my entire world was collapsing around me. I'll be right back to take care of this. I saw relief flash across Jasmine's face, saw Curtis relax back into his chair, saw various relatives nod and return to their conversations, assured that I would do what I always did, which was pay without complaint, sacrifice without limit, give until there was nothing left. I walked out of that private dining room with my back straight and my head held high, channeling every ounce of dignity I had left. I walked through the main dining area of the Bayou Room, where other people were having normal dinners with normal families who presumably didn't treat each other like human ATM machines. I walked past the hostess stand, where the young woman smiled at me pleasantly. I walked out the heavy front door into the warm September night air of the French Quarter. And then I kept walking. I didn't look back. I walked 2 blocks down Royal Street until I saw a taxi dropping off passengers at another restaurant, and I waved it down with desperate urgency. Garden District, I told the driver, giving him my address, my voice sounding strange and distant in my own ears. And please hurry. As the taxi pulled away from the curb and merged into the evening traffic of the French Quarter, I turned in my seat and looked back at the Bayou Room, watching it grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared from view. I imagined the chaos that was probably beginning to unfold right about now. The head waiter returning to find my seat empty, Jasmine checking the restroom, then checking outside, then slowly realizing I wasn't coming back. The panic setting in as they understood that the bill was still sitting there unpaid, that their personal ATM had finally shut down, that someone was going to have to take responsibility for a nearly $20,000 dinner. I wondered who would step up. Jasmine, who had organized this humiliation? Curtis, who had smirked while watching me suffer? Aisha, who drove a Lexus but claimed to be perpetually broke? Roel, who always had an emergency that required my money? I felt no guilt about leaving them there with that bill. For the first time in decades, I felt no guilt about saying no to my family, even if I'd said it by walking away rather than with words. When I got home to my small house in the Garden District, the house Thomas and I had bought 35 years ago and filled with love and books and dreams, I locked the door behind me and leaned against it, finally allowing myself to cry. I cried for hours that night, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep in my soul. I cried for all the years I'd allowed myself to be used. I cried for the relationship with my daughter that had been rotting from the inside for so long I'd stopped noticing the smell. I cried for Thomas, who had died and left me alone to face this family that saw me only as a source of money. But somewhere in those tears, somewhere in that grief and rage and humiliation, something shifted inside me. Something hard and determined took root where soft generosity used to live. By the time the sun rose on Sunday morning, I had made a decision that would change everything. I was done. Not just done paying for that dinner, done with all of it, done being the family ATM, done sacrificing my own security and happiness for people who showed me nothing but contempt, done enabling grown adults who refused to take responsibility for their own lives. I spent that entire Sunday doing something I'd never done before. I blocked every single family member's phone number: Jasmine, Curtis, Aisha, Roel, Malik, every cousin, every niece, every nephew who had ever asked me for money and then disappeared until the next crisis. One by one, I went through my phone and blocked them all, feeling lighter with each number I removed from my available contacts. Then I sat down at my kitchen table with a notepad and a pen, and I made a list of everything I needed to do to completely change my life. First item: move away from New Orleans. I couldn't stay in this city where I'd run into family members at the grocery store or the pharmacy, where they'd show up at my door demanding explanations and money, where I'd be trapped by proximity and guilt and 62 years of conditioning to always say yes. I needed distance. I needed space. I needed to disappear as thoroughly as I disappeared from that restaurant. Second item: change my phone number completely. Blocking wasn't enough because they'd find ways around it, calling from borrowed phones or unknown numbers, leaving voicemails that would slowly erode my resolve with guilt and manipulation. I needed a clean break, a new number that only people I chose to give it to would have. Third item: close my local bank accounts and open new ones at a different bank. I didn't trust that Jasmine wouldn't somehow find a way to access my accounts, to forge a check or claim some emergency that required my authorization. Everything needed to be protected, locked down, inaccessible to the family that had bled me dry for decades. Fourth item: write letters. Not to apologize or explain or justify my actions, but to clearly state my boundaries and make it absolutely clear that I was done being their source of money. Letters they could read and reread, that left no room for misinterpretation or manipulation. By Monday morning, I had already begun executing my plan with a methodical determination I didn't know I possessed. I called a realtor I'd met years ago at a teachers' conference and told her I needed to sell my house quickly, quietly, and for cash if possible. She asked if everything was okay, and I told her the truth. My family had been exploiting me financially for years, and I needed to escape before they destroyed me completely. She understood immediately, told me she'd seen similar situations before, and promised to find a buyer within 30 days. I started packing that same day, sorting through 35 years of accumulated possessions, deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. I packed my books first, hundreds of them, my most precious possessions. Toni Morrison, and Maya Angelou, and Langston Hughes, and Zora Neale Hurston. First editions I'd collected over decades. Annotated copies I'd used for teaching. Every book represented a piece of my intellectual life that had nothing to do with being someone's ATM. I packed Thomas's photographs, our wedding album, the small box of his personal items I'd kept after he died. I packed my teaching awards and certificates, reminders of a career I'd been proud of before I'd allowed my family to reduce me to nothing but a source of funding. I donated most of my furniture to charity. I wanted nothing from this life except what truly mattered, what couldn't be replaced, what represented who I was rather than who my family had made me. On Tuesday, I drove 2 hours north to Baton Rouge to look at apartments. I'd chosen Baton Rouge deliberately because it was close enough to still be in Louisiana, still feel somewhat familiar, but far enough that my family wouldn't casually drop by. I found a small 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood near the LSU campus, second floor of a well-maintained building with a balcony overlooking a community garden. The rent was $950 a month, easily affordable on my pension, and it was available immediately. I signed the lease that afternoon, paying first and last month's rent plus deposit with a check from my old account that would clear before I closed it. On Wednesday, I went to a different bank across town and opened completely new accounts, transferring all my money from my old bank through a cashier's check that couldn't be traced or reversed. The bank officer who helped me was a kind woman in her 50s who asked no questions but gave me a look of understanding and support that made me feel less alone. On Thursday, I bought a new cell phone with a new number from a different carrier and sent exactly 3 people my new contact information. My realtor, my new landlord in Baton Rouge, and my friend Diane, who was a fellow retired teacher and the only person I truly trusted. Nobody else. Not a single family member. Not even distant cousins who'd never asked me for money. A clean break meant clean, with no exceptions. On Friday morning, I loaded my packed belongings into a rental truck I'd reserved. It didn't take as long as I'd expected because I was leaving so much behind. By noon, I was driving north on Interstate 10 toward Baton Rouge, leaving behind New Orleans and my old life and the family that had used me up, until there was nothing left but rage and determination. I didn't look back at the city as it disappeared in my rearview mirror. I looked forward toward whatever came next, toward whatever life I could build for myself at 62 years old with no family support but also no family exploitation. The apartment in Baton Rouge felt enormous despite being smaller than my house had been, because it was entirely mine. No daughter showing up unannounced to check my wallet, no sister calling with fake emergencies, no cousin whispering urgent needs in my ear. Just silence and space, and the freedom to exist without being anyone's ATM. I spent the first week unpacking slowly, placing my books on the built-in shelves, hanging Thomas's photograph on the wall where I could see it every morning, arranging my small apartment into a sanctuary that represented the new life I was building. The balcony became my favorite space. I bought seeds and soil and small pots, and I started a container garden with herbs and tomatoes and flowers, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for because I was too busy solving everyone else's problems. I planted basil and rosemary and thyme, their fragrance filling the air whenever I touched their leaves. I planted cherry tomatoes that grew quickly and abundantly, bright red fruits I could pick fresh for my salads. I planted marigolds and petunias, flowers that attracted butterflies and added color to my little balcony sanctuary. Gardening became my therapy, my meditation, my way of nurturing something that actually appreciated my care, instead of demanding more and more until I had nothing left to give. Every morning, I woke up early and went out to my balcony to water my plants and check their progress, feeling peace settle into my bones in a way I hadn't experienced in decades. 6 weeks after I moved to Baton Rouge, my house in New Orleans sold for slightly above asking price to a young couple who loved the Garden District and didn't need to know anything about the complicated history that had unfolded within those walls. After paying off the remaining mortgage balance, the realtor's commission, and various closing costs, I walked away with $185,000 in equity that I immediately deposited into my new bank account, money that represented decades of payments and upkeep and sacrifice, money that was now mine and mine alone to protect and preserve. That same week, I met David at the community garden near my apartment building. I had started volunteering there on Saturday mornings, helping to maintain the raised beds and teaching children from the neighborhood about growing vegetables. David was a recently retired veterinarian, 65 years old, tall and lean with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He'd been volunteering at the garden for 3 years, he told me, ever since his wife passed away from cancer, and he'd needed something to fill his days with purpose and connection. We started talking about tomatoes, about the best varieties to grow in Louisiana's humid climate, about proper pruning techniques and pest management. Conversations that were easy and comfortable, with no underlying agenda, no requests for money, no manipulation disguised as family love. Just two people who enjoyed gardening, sharing knowledge, and companionship. He invited me for coffee after our volunteer shift, and I accepted, feeling nervous in a way I hadn't felt in decades. We talked for 3 hours at a small cafe near the LSU campus, discussing books and teaching and loss and the different ways grief changes us. David had also experienced financial exploitation, though from a different angle. His adult son had racked up gambling debts and had stolen money from his parents' accounts to pay them off, creating a rift that had never fully healed before his wife died. He understood the pain of being used by people you loved, the guilt that came with setting boundaries, the complicated grief of mourning relationships that were toxic but still precious because they were family. Over the following months, David and I became close. Not romantic at first, just friends who understood each other's wounds, who could talk honestly about the families we'd left behind without judgment or pressure to reconcile. He helped me expand my balcony garden, building custom shelving that tripled my growing space. I helped him organize his late wife's belongings, a task he'd been avoiding for 2 years but finally felt ready to tackle with someone who understood loss. 7 months after I moved to Baton Rouge, Jasmine finally tracked me down. I don't know how she did it, whether she hired someone or simply got lucky or wore down Diane until my friend finally gave her my new number. My phone rang on a Tuesday morning while I was watering my plants, and Jasmine's name appeared on the screen, a name I hadn't seen in 7 months. A name that still made my stomach clench with anxiety and old programming. I almost didn't answer. I stood there on my balcony holding my watering can, watching the phone ring and ring, remembering everything that had led to this moment. The years of exploitation, the public humiliation, the $19,000 dinner bill I'd walked away from, the decision to disappear and rebuild my life without them. But something made me answer. Some need for closure or perhaps simple curiosity about what she could possibly say after everything she'd done. "Mama," Jasmine's voice came through the phone, and she was crying, genuine tears I could hear choking her words. "Mama, please, I need to talk to you. I need to tell you what happened after you left." I didn't respond immediately, just waited in silence, giving her nothing, no reassurance, no immediate forgiveness, no automatic acceptance of whatever excuse or manipulation she was about to offer. "Everything fell apart," she continued, her voice breaking. "The restaurant called the police. They threatened to press charges for theft of services. Curtis and I had to sign over our car as collateral while we figured out how to pay. We lost the car, Mama. They sold it to cover part of the bill. We still owed $12,000 after that. We had to take out loans from predatory lenders at terrible interest rates. Curtis lost his job because we kept getting calls from debt collectors at his workplace. We lost our apartment because we couldn't make rent. We've been living with his brother in his 1-bedroom apartment for the past 5 months, all 3 of us sharing a couch in his living room." I listened to all of this without speaking, without offering sympathy or solutions or money, just listening as my daughter described the natural consequences of her own choices finally catching up with her. "Aisha and Roel are furious with me," Jasmine went on. "They say I ruined everything by being too greedy, too obvious. They say you would have kept helping all of us if I hadn't pushed too far. They're not speaking to me anymore. Nobody in the family is speaking to me. They all blame me for losing access to your money." "Is that why you're calling?" I asked finally, my voice calm and neutral. "Because you lost access to my money? Because the family ATM finally shut down permanently and you want me to turn it back on? No, Jasmine said, and she was crying harder now. I'm calling because I finally understand what I did to you. What we all did to you for years. Mama, I didn't see you as a person. I saw you as a resource, as something that existed to make my life easier. I treated you worse than I would treat a stranger on the street. And that dinner, that horrible dinner, that was me showing off how much control I had over you. How I could humiliate you publicly and you'd still pay because that's what you always did. I've been in therapy, she continued. Not the expensive kind, just free counseling through a community center. My therapist helped me see how toxic I was, how I'd learned to manipulate you, how I'd never had to grow up or take responsibility because you always caught me when I fell. She helped me understand that losing you was the best thing that could have happened to me because it finally forced me to face who I'd become. I'm not calling to ask for money, Jasmine said. I know you won't give it to me and you shouldn't. I'm calling to say I'm sorry, to tell you that you were right to leave, to let you know that I'm finally trying to become the daughter you deserve to have instead of the parasite I actually was. I stood on my balcony holding the phone, looking at the tomato plants David had helped me stake properly, at the herbs flourishing in their pots, at the marigolds attracting butterflies in the morning sun. I thought about responding with anger, with a catalog of every way she'd hurt me over the years. But what came out instead was something simpler and more honest. Thank you for saying that, Jasmine. It means more than you know to hear you acknowledge what happened. But I need you to understand something. I forgive you, but forgiveness doesn't mean going back to how things were. Forgiveness doesn't mean opening my wallet again. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting you back into my life without boundaries that I will enforce absolutely. I understand, Jasmine said quietly. I don't expect anything from you, Mama. I don't deserve anything from you. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to change, that I'm working and paying off my debts slowly, that Curtis and I are getting divorced because our marriage was built on using you, and without that, it just fell apart. I wanted you to know that I finally see what I did, and I'm sorry. We talked for another 30 minutes, the longest honest conversation we'd had in years, maybe ever. Jasmine told me she'd gotten a job at a small graphic design firm, entry-level work that actually used her degree for the first time in her life. She told me about the therapy sessions that had opened her eyes to her own behavior. She told me about the divorce proceedings with Curtis, how they'd both agreed it was over, how they were dividing what little they had left and trying to finish things as civilly as possible. I heard genuine growth in her voice, real change, not the performative apologies I'd heard so many times before. But I also heard something else. A desperation for my approval, a hope that this conversation might lead to reconciliation on her terms. Jasmine, I said gently but firmly, I'm proud of you for getting that job and going to therapy and taking responsibility for your life. But I need you to understand that our relationship will never be what it was. I can't be your safety net anymore. I can't be the person you call when things get hard. You need to build your own life, solve your own problems, stand on your own feet without me propping you up. I know, she said, and I could hear her crying again. I just hope that maybe someday, when I've really changed, when I've proven that I'm different, maybe we can have some kind of relationship again. Even if it's small, even if it's just phone calls once in a while. I miss you, Mama. Not your money. You. Maybe someday, I said, and I meant it, though I had no idea what that future might look like. But that day isn't today, and it won't be tomorrow. You need time to grow, and I need time to heal. And we both need to learn how to be ourselves without the toxic patterns we built over decades. After we hung up, I sat on my balcony for a long time, processing the conversation, feeling a complicated mixture of hope and caution and old wounds that weren't quite ready to close. David came by that evening as he often did, bringing fresh vegetables from his own garden and a bottle of wine to share. I told him about Jasmine's call, about the apology, about my conflicted feelings. You don't owe her immediate forgiveness, David said, his voice calm and wise. You don't owe her a relationship just because she's your daughter. She has to earn her way back into your life slowly, through consistent, changed behavior, not just words and promises. She has to prove she sees you as a person, not as a resource, and that takes time, real time, months and years of demonstrating new patterns. Don't let guilt rush you into letting her back in before you're ready. His words gave me permission to take my time, to trust my instincts, to protect the peace I'd worked so hard to build. Over the following months, Jasmine called occasionally, always briefly, always respecting my boundaries when I said I needed to go. She never asked for money. She never created emergencies that required my intervention. She just checked in, told me about her progress, her job, her therapy, her slowly improving life. 14 months after that first phone call, Jasmine asked if she could visit me in Baton Rouge. She'd saved money for a bus ticket, had a weekend off from work, wanted to see me in person if I was willing. I hesitated for days before saying yes, terrified it might be a trap, a setup for manipulation, a return to old patterns. But David encouraged me to give her a chance while maintaining firm boundaries, so I agreed to one lunch at a restaurant where I could leave if things went badly. She arrived on a Saturday afternoon, looking different than I remembered. Thinner, with less expensive clothes and simpler hair, but also more present somehow, more real, less performative. We met at a small cafe near my apartment, neutral territory, and talked for 3 hours over sandwiches and iced tea. Jasmine told me about her work at the design agency, showing me her portfolio on her phone with genuine pride in what she'd created. She told me about her small studio apartment that she was renting on her own, showing me pictures of the modest but clean space she'd furnished gradually with second-hand finds. She told me about paying down her debts month by month, the satisfaction of seeing the balances decrease through her own effort rather than my money. She asked about my life in Baton Rouge, and I showed her pictures of my balcony garden, told her about David, about my volunteer work, about the book club I joined with other retired teachers. We talked like two adults having a genuine conversation rather than mother and daughter trapped in toxic patterns. When lunch ended and we stood up to leave, Jasmine hugged me, and for the first time in years it felt genuine rather than manipulative. "Thank you for giving me this chance, Mama," she said. "I know I don't deserve it. I know I destroyed what we had. But I'm going to keep working on myself, keep growing, keep proving that I've changed. Not to manipulate you into helping me again, but because it's the right thing to do, because I want to be someone you can actually be proud of. I am proud of you," I told her honestly. "Proud of the work you're doing, the responsibility you're taking, the person you're becoming. But pride doesn't mean going back to how things were. It means respecting what we're both building now separately." She nodded, understanding in her eyes, and left to catch her bus back to New Orleans. I watched her walk away down the street, and I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the possibility of it somewhere in the future. 2 years after that night at the Bayou Room, when I'd walked away from the $19,000 bill and the family that had used me for decades, I stood in my balcony garden on a beautiful spring morning and realized something profound. I was happy. Genuinely, completely, peacefully happy in a way I couldn't remember ever feeling before. My plants were thriving, growing abundantly in their containers. My relationship with David had deepened into something that felt both comfortable and exciting. My days were full but not overwhelming, structured around things I chose rather than obligations forced upon me by people who saw me only as a source of money. I woke up each morning without the anxiety that had plagued me for years, without dreading phone calls that would inevitably end in requests for cash, without wondering which family crisis I'd be expected to solve with my checkbook. I was finally, truly free. Jasmine visited every few months now, always on her own dime, always respecting my boundaries, always showing me through consistent actions rather than empty words that she had genuinely changed. She'd been promoted at the design agency, was building a career she was proud of, had paid off most of her debts through her own hard work. We'd never be as close as we once were, that much was clear and probably healthy, but we were building something new. Something based on mutual respect rather than financial exploitation. On a warm Saturday afternoon in April, exactly 2 years after walking out of the Bayou Room, I decided to do something symbolic to mark my transformation. I bought seeds for a special flower at the nursery near my apartment, something the salesman told me was called Queen of the Night, a variety of orchid cactus that bloomed only once a year but put on the most spectacular show when it did. Resilient, rare, beautiful, blooming on its own schedule regardless of what anyone expected, it seemed perfect. David came over to help me plant it in a special large pot I'd bought for the occasion. We chose a spot on my balcony where it would get morning sun and afternoon shade, the ideal conditions for this particular plant. While he prepared the soil mixture with the special cactus blend the nursery had recommended, I carefully removed the plant from its temporary container, handling its roots with gentle care. When we finally settled it into its new home and watered it thoroughly, David looked at me with that warm smile I'd come to love over the past 2 years. "This plant is going to bloom magnificently," he said, putting his arm around my shoulders. "Just like you have." We stood there on my balcony, surrounded by all the plants I'd nurtured, each one representing something about my journey. The herbs were my rediscovered pleasure in small daily joys. The tomatoes were my self-sufficiency and ability to provide for myself. The marigolds were my acceptance that some things are temporary but still worth celebrating. And now this Queen of the Night would be my symbol of blooming on my own terms, regardless of anyone else's expectations or demands. That evening, I sat down at my small desk and did something I'd been thinking about for months. I started writing a book about my experience, about being the family ATM, about the slow erosion of self-worth that happens when you're treated as a resource rather than a person, about finding the courage to walk away even when guilt and conditioning scream at you to stay. I wrote for 3 hours that night, the words pouring out of me like they'd been waiting years to be released. Over the following months, I wrote every morning after tending my garden, David and Diane reading chapters and offering feedback, both of them encouraging me to be as honest and raw as possible. I found a small, independent publisher in Baton Rouge who specialized in memoirs by Southern women, and they were immediately interested in my story. The book was published 8 months later with a simple title, Walking Away, One Woman's Journey, From Family ATM to Financial Freedom. I didn't expect it to reach many people. Thought maybe a few hundred copies would sell to women in similar situations who needed to hear they weren't alone. But letters started arriving almost immediately, dozens at first, then hundreds, from women all over Louisiana and beyond who had read my story and found pieces of themselves in my narrative. Women who'd been exploited by adult children, by siblings, by extended family members who saw them as walking wallets. Women who'd been too afraid or too guilty to set boundaries until my story gave them permission. One letter in particular moved me to tears. It was from a 5-8-year-old woman in Mississippi who'd been supporting her 3 adult sons and their families for 15 years, slowly bankrupting herself in the process. She wrote that reading my book had given her the courage to finally say no, to stop enabling their dependence, to choose her own financial security over their comfort. "Your story saved my financial future," she wrote, "and probably my life. Thank you for having the courage to share your truth." On the 2-year anniversary of walking out of that restaurant, I organized a small gathering in my apartment. David was there, of course. Diane brought her husband. Friends from my book club came. Jasmine drove up from New Orleans with her new boyfriend. A quiet, kind man who treated her with genuine respect and worked as a middle school teacher. Even Avery, my cousin who'd driven 4 hours to attend, showed up with a beautiful plant as a gift. It wasn't a celebration of anything specific, just a gathering of people who mattered, people who saw me as a complete human being rather than a source of money. We cooked together, filling my small kitchen with laughter and the smell of good food. We shared stories and memories. And when the sun began to set, painting my balcony in shades of gold and pink, I raised my glass of wine and made a toast. "To second chances," I said, looking around at these faces I'd chosen to have in my life. "To the courage to say no, to walking away when staying would destroy you, to the gardens we build after everything burns down, and to the families we create, not just the ones we're born into." Everyone raised their glasses and drank. Jasmine looked at me with tears in her eyes and mouthed silently, "Thank you, Mama. I love you." I nodded back, acknowledging her words without the automatic forgiveness I would have offered 2 years ago. That night, after everyone had left, and I was alone in my apartment with David washing dishes beside me in comfortable silence, I looked out at my balcony garden. Every plant I'd sown was thriving under the evening stars. The queen of the night stood tall in its pot, preparing for its eventual spectacular bloom. I was no longer anyone's ATM. I was Susan Richardson, a 6'4" woman who'd learned that saving yourself isn't selfishness, it's survival. That saying no isn't cruelty, it's self-respect. That walking away is sometimes the only path to truly living. That is Susan Richardson's story. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this from? What city? What country? Drop it in the comments below. I love seeing our global community come together over these powerful stories about mothers who finally said enough, about families who learned respect the hard way, and about the moment when being generous turns into being exploited. Real question. If you were Susan, sitting in that restaurant watching your daughter shout, "My mama is our personal ATM, order whatever you want," in front of 35 relatives, what would you have done? Would you have walked out like she did? Would you have paid the bill to avoid a scene, or would you have handled it differently? Tell me in the comments, because I genuinely want to know how you would respond to that level of public humiliation after decades of sacrifice. Hit that like button if this story resonated with you on a deep level. Share it if you know someone who's being treated like a family ATM, someone who's constantly giving money to adult children who never pay it back, someone who's supporting relatives who show no appreciation and only call when they need something, someone who needs to hear that it's okay to walk away, that setting boundaries isn't selfish, that you can love your family and still protect yourself from their exploitation. And subscribe for more raw, real stories about mothers who refuse to be walking wallets, daughters who learned that actions have consequences, families who mistook unconditional love for unlimited funding, and what happens when the person who always said yes finally says no and means it. This story is about more than just one woman walking out on a $19,000 restaurant bill. It's about recognizing when generosity becomes exploitation. It's about understanding that you can sacrifice for your family without sacrificing yourself completely. It's about knowing that being a good mother doesn't mean funding your adult children's entire lives while they show you nothing but contempt. Thanks for watching. Remember, you are not obligated to financially support adult children who refuse to support themselves. Your pension and retirement savings are not your family's emergency fund. Being generous doesn't mean allowing yourself to be used until there's nothing left, and teaching people to respect you sometimes means letting them experience the consequences of taking you for granted. See you in the next video.